I can remember being at dancing school when I was about 3. And I guess if I had to think of an earliest memory, it'd be that. I can just remember being there, and my mama was sitting out waiting for me, and what can you do when you're 3 at dancing school? We lived several blocks from where I was going to go to kindergarten, and we walked over to the school to pick up sugar with ration tickets. That's one thing I remember. And then my cousin lived in the neighborhood, and she had a house that had steps going up from the sidewalk, and then big pillars or posts like where you'd set flower pots on. And I remember her standing on the top of that, dropping her mother's shoes and saying, "Bombs away over Tokyo." Once in a while, maybe a couple of times, we'd go down to Union Station and invite a serviceman to come home and have dinner with us. And we'd take him home and feed him dinner, and he'd go back. Now, that's about it. When I was 12 or 13 in that area, and we lived in South St. Louis, we had one car, in which my dad took to work, which was okay because the grocery store, well, there was one on every corner, and school I could walk to, and church I could walk to, and we had public transportation. And I would take 2 buses and a streetcar to go up to see a dermatologist right by where Powell Hall is in the Fox, by myself. Would you let your 13-year-old daughter go on a bus and a streetcar to the doctor by herself? You would be hesitant, yeah. The Missouri Theater building across from Powell Hall, which is now a hotel, used to be a lot of doctors' offices. And yeah, because we'd go to the movies up there. There were 3 or 4 movies theaters right on the street there, and some on Olive, and yeah. But we'd take the bus all the time, and that was fine. But that was big Sunday afternoon entertainment for the 13-year-old set to go to the movies on Sunday afternoon. They were older when I was born. My dad was 41 and my mother 37. I thought that was so old, but it turned out it wasn't. My mother grew up on a farm near Wright City on the site of what is now Incline Village Golf Course. And I had the opportunity to drive the golf course and see, I remember going there when my uncle owned the property, and there was a pond, and my mother and I were swimming in the pond, and my dad and my uncle came by on a tractor, and we found that pond. And there's a little graveyard on the site also where my mother's oldest brother, the first of the 10 children, was buried. He died as an infant. My mother was the 10th of 10 children, and I'm a lovable only child. My mother came to St. Louis in her late teens and went to Rubicon Business School, and she worked as a comptometer operator. She had an 8th grade education. She'd gone to a one-room schoolhouse, but yet she was one of the smartest women I knew. My dad was tall. He had prematurely white hair from age 30 on. He was an iron worker, had been in the Navy, worked for Frew & Collin Construction Company, and so I'm told, put the flagpole up on top of what used to be the Southwestern Bell Telephone Company building downtown, and that was the tallest building in St. Louis at that time. So he worked hard. He was a Shriner, and he was part of the Arab Patrol, the marching unit, and those were his good buddies. The family was active in Grace Church, which was 2 blocks away from where we lived, and we could walk to church or drive to church, and always that was a very important part of our life. My dad died when I was 14, unexpectedly to me. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and at that time he went into the old St. Anthony's Hospital for exploratory surgery, and they opened him up, found the pancreatic cancer, and closed him up, and he was dead within a week. I didn't expect that he was going to die. So my mother had kind of a snarky teenage daughter. I didn't see him in the hospital. I went the night before he went for surgery, and then I didn't go. My mother had gone during the daylight hours, I think, and then came home. It was like, well, I'm 14 years old. Who's going to give me away when I get married? You know, I remember having weird thoughts like that, focusing on me. Not that my dad was dead, but, you know, my dad, having been an iron worker, would go on strike frequently. And the summer before he died, my mother, in her little Germanic way, would say, well, I guess I just better go get a job. And she did, and she went to work in industry for the first time in 20 years, I guess. And so she was already in the workplace at that time. So, you know, after a whirlwind 3 days of funerals and all that stuff, we just settled into the life with the 2 of us. And it was that way until I got married. So I always lived at home until I got married. The women were in teaching, or nursing school wasn't there, so, you know, 80% of my friends and I were in education, either elementary or high school, and those were either that or office worker were the professions that people went to. Now my friends, several of them have gotten MBAs in business and social work and those kind of things. So people my age have diversified as we went on. And while I got my bachelor's degree in education, I taught for 3 years in normal schools. And then I took time off and had my kids, and when they started back in school, I substituted and taught a little more. Then we moved to New Jersey at a time where teaching jobs were rare. So I decided I would see what else is out there, and I got in human resources. And I used my teaching experience by becoming a trainer. And I found out that Gold Stars work for adults as well as kids. And I developed some training programs, or did some canned programs and things, and just had fun with teaching too. So just because I was an elementary teacher, I still had a whole different career path once I hit 35 or so. And at this time, Stan is dating Janet, who is also a Theta with us at Washington University and a good friend. I graduated from college, immediately went to Camp Shoshone to be a camp counselor for the summer. Janet went off to Europe, and I had met Stan through engagement parties and rehearsal dinners, and I knew who he was, and yada, yada, yada. So I come back from Camp Shoshone. Janet comes back from Europe. Stan's working at Wagner Electric, and he's pouting because he doesn't want to call Janet again. So he's pouting, and his mother says, well, there's that cute Sharon Anderson who was in Jerry and Jane's wedding. Why don't you call her? And so in late October of 1961, we went on our first date. So we went to see the Guns of Navarone, and then afterwards he said, well, would you like to go out for a bite to eat? And I said, that'd be nice, thank you. So we went downtown to the Jefferson Hotel. He thought maybe we could dance a little, so we went in and we ordered a drink each. And we danced, and there were half a dozen people there was all, and they were probably a lot older than we were. And then he said, well, would you like something to eat? And I said, yeah, that'd be nice. He said, how about a little roast beef sandwich? I said, oh, that'd be fine. So he called the waiter over, and we ordered open-faced roast beef sandwiches, some fries, and another drink. I think it was a bourbon and water or something like that, something exotic. And we enjoyed our dinner and danced a little more, and this was a nice evening. And then the bill came, and this was before credit cards, and it was $14. And Stan just whipped out money and paid for it. $14 was a lot of money, and Stan was notoriously sure of his finances, shall we say. And we laughed about it for years later when we'd go out and spend, a couple $100 on dinner. I think he wanted to protect his investment. And we went home and we started dating, and we got engaged in February, and we got married the next August. And 56 years later, we were still happy. We had a small duplex in University City, and he was working at Wagner Electric at that time as an engineer. And we just had a nice little social life and got to know each other, and built a house in Kirkwood then in another year, and moved to Kirkwood in 1963, and had our first baby in 1965. So that was definitely settling in. My mom and I were cleaning house on Saturday, and Harry Carey says, "It's a beautiful day in St. Louis. Come on down for the ball game." And we looked at each other, and we said, "Let's do it." And we did it. So, and I also remember I went to a game, a city series game with my dad, between the Cardinals and the Browns, and we sat in box seats, and I wore high heel shoes. It was absolutely fantastic. Bob Bauman, who was a trainer for the Cardinals, was a friend of Stan's mother. So Hilda asked Bob Bauman if she could get tickets for the World Series. And Bob came up with these tickets, and they were going to be $12 each. And Stan said, "Can we afford that?" This was about, well, it was 67, so it was 5 years after we were married. I said, "Uh-huh." We started to go down to our seats, and they had so many tickets sold out for this that they put an extra folding chair on each step. So I was in row 2 and Stan was in row 3 on the folding chairs. And there was Carl Yastrzemski, my birthday buddy, and I could count his fillings practically. We were that close to him. And it was wonderful, and Gibson pitched, and McCarver caught, and the Cardinals won, so we all went home happy. 1975 was the fall of Vietnam. And First Presbyterian Church, under the leadership then of a woman named Carolyn Schaefer, decided that the church should sponsor a refugee family. A family was coming, and it was to be a mother, father, their 10 children, plus 3 siblings of one of their daughters-in-law. And there was the 10-year-old boy that we took, just was going to be temporary, just get to know him. He was an age right in between my 2 boys. Well, Ton got here, and my guys immediately fell in love with him, as did I and Stan, and we just decided this kid was here for a reason. And so we went through all the loops of getting him into foster care. We became foster parents to him, and we're frequently asked, would you adopt him? And the answer was, his parents are alive. We won't adopt him, but we will care for him. 1980, we had gotten the rest of his family, Ton's family, of mom and dad and 9 out of their 10 kids to the United States. So eventually came back to St. Louis and had done so well in some of his other jobs that he started buying houses. He owns 7 houses in the Kirkwood, Rock Hill area, and he rents them, and he collects rent money, and he plays golf. He's just one of a kind, and he takes good care of me. Stan was part of Wagner Electric, and they were big in St. Louis at that time. And then they were bought out by other companies, and corporate headquarters moved to Parsippany, New Jersey. And it was a case of, well, do you want to move or do you want to find another job? At that time, Bruce was a sophomore in high school, and Jeff was in 8th grade. And we said, why not? Why not? So after living in Kirkwood from 63 to 1980, we picked up stakes and we moved. And it was eye-opening for us all. It was interesting. It made us grow. We grew as a family. My kids adjusted pretty well. I remember, 8th grade I thought was always the worst year for boys ever. And I remember when we got to New Jersey after a couple months, Jeff at North Kirkwood Middle School was one of the cool kids and had the right group of friends. And he got to Mendham, and that wasn't the case, and all these people had their little groups and so forth. But I remember coming home from, I guess I came home from work, and he was crying on his bed. He says, I want to go home. I said, this is home. But he got through it, and he had a decent high school experience and made friends there. We had a cute group of 4 or 5 guys that came over to play poker every Friday night, and that was fun. And Bruce was just there 2.5 years and then went off to Purdue. And so we were in New Jersey for 5 years, and Stan changed jobs. He went to work for Robert Bosch, which was a German company, but they were headquarters in Farmington Hills right by Detroit. But that was Jeff's senior year in high school, and I didn't want to make him transfer schools again as a senior, and I had a job I loved in New Jersey. So he and I stayed there, and Stan got an apartment in Detroit or Farmington Hills and commuted, because he was gone off to Europe and stuff for weeks at a time, and so it was okay. So Jeff went off to WashU, and we were there, and Stan got an opportunity to go with a new division of Tenneco Automotive that was just starting up. His whole career had been in brakes, so he was really familiar with anti-lock brakes at the beginning and so forth, and he was hired away from Bosch to go to work for Tenneco. as we moved, we were always going to be permanently in New Jersey, and that lasted 4 years or 5 years. We were going to be permanent in Detroit, and that lasted 1 year for me. And then in Chicago, we were going to be there 6 months, and we were there 10 years. So some things you can plan, some things you can't. And each move was the right move at the right time. I've been a Jeopardy watcher for a long, long time, and Jeopardy was going to come to Chicago for tryouts. And since that was one time that my kids really think I'm smart was when we were watching Jeopardy, I sent in the postcard, and I went downtown Chicago to the tryouts, and first thing was a written test. So they called me and said, we'd like you to be on the seniors tournament. We will pay your way to Los Angeles. We will put you up for 3 nights at the Beverly Hilton, and we will pay you at least a minimum of $1,000. I said, I can do that. It was a harrowing experience. First of all, we were in the green room for days, it seemed like, just waiting to be called. So I went out there and did okay. I did fine. I was leading at the end of first half, and then I kind of froze up in the second half. But the crowning moment was Final Jeopardy, when the category was engineering. I always relied on Stan for my engineering prowess. He wasn't around. But I answered the question correctly. It was something about, and it gave a whole lot of letters, about something that was an engineering marvel. And the answer was the channel, which was fairly new in operation at that point in time. So then we retired and came back to St. Louis. Our roots were here. 6 months before we were transferred to New Jersey, our house in Kirkwood was almost paid for, and we needed to have another source of tax write-offs. So Stan says to me, gee, that'd be really nice if we had a farm. I said, what? I'm a city girl. I don't want no stinking farm. So September, later in the month, Stan had the first of his 2 bypass surgeries at age 45. So he's sitting in the hospital with a lot of time to think. And he thought, I just really, really, really want to know about a farm. And so on New Year's Eve day of 1979 turning into 1980, Ralph met us out in New Haven and showed us 3 places. And the first 2 were like deer camp, and I thought, oh, criminy, I don't want any part of this. But then we're driving along, Ralph's in one car and we're in another, and we're on this beautiful, windy, curvy road. And I look over and I see, now there, that'd be a nice farmhouse. That looks cool. And Ralph turned into that driveway. So long story short, we bought that property in March of 1980. It was to be a weekend house when we first bought it, yeah, but when we got back and retired, it was kind of a reverse weekend because I had a job that, you know, I'd finished on Monday evening, and we'd go out and spend Monday to Friday and come home and party or do what in church and stuff over the weekend. And it was great. I had different favorites. I loved New Jersey because I had a fabulous job there. I had a job that just let me grow, and people that I loved working with, and I learned so much because I'd never really been in industry before. And I love that. I love the part that we were a mile from Jockey Hollow, which was a winter headquarters of Washington's troops that somehow was after Valley Forge, but it held 10,000 soldiers in the winter. And I loved the Presbyterian church there, which had stained glass windows. One was of Witherspoon signing the Declaration of Independence, and the other was of George Washington serving communion out in the courtyard or the area of the Morristown Presbyterian Church. So that sense of history was great. I loved that we were an hour from Manhattan, so we could go in there on our own terms. Okay, what did I like about Detroit? Let me think on that. We could never find a church home. We lived this far away from Farmington Hills Presbyterian Church, which on the first Sunday I went there was the senior minister who'd been there forever announcing his retirement. I had a beautiful house in Farmington Hills because the housing prices in New Jersey were here and they were here, and you had to put all the money that you were buying, back into this house. So they said, well, you have to spend this much more money. Okay, you want a sprinkler system in the lawn? Fine, let's put in a sprinkler system. You want Corian countertops? Okay, no problem. You want let's just wallpaper the kitchen instead of having it done. So that was fun. And then we moved to Chicago, where we were only going to be there for 6 months, and it turned out we were there for 10 years. And we had a lovely home, and Stan had a great job working with great people, and we had so much fun with them. And I became part of the Libertyville Presbyterian Church, and that was a highlight. That's where I was an elder. And I loved that, again, we could go into Chicago on our own terms, and we did that, and it was great. And of course, Chicago is where everybody comes to visit you. So we had wonderful times there. I'm an extrovert. Stan was an introvert. We meshed perfectly. When David Hollian was asking about what did you want to know about everybody to know about Stan for his memorial service, I said, well, he put spots on my frog. And David looked at me just like that and said, what does that mean? I said, well, I'd get ideas and he'd make them better. And one time we had a family camp where there was an exercise to do a reminder of camp without talking, and I drew a little frog. And he put spots on my frog, and it looked so much better. So we were a good team, and that's kind of the hard part for me right now, is not being part of a team. Losing him was tough. However, he had outlived his father by 25 years. He had outlived his grandfather. His grandfather died in his early 50s. We were of that generation where all the men were dying in their 50s of heart stuff. It's in the genes. Stan had his first bypass when he was 45 years old. 1979. He had a second one in 1993. So, I had this long history of tending to his health. And he never fussed. He never fussed. And if the doctors in any of these procedures said, do cardiac rehab, he was there, and he minded them, and he listened to them on what he should eat and how he should live, and all this stuff. And so he was just so amenable to life. And just being with him at the farm where he had projects. He was in his glory. And, we just had such a good time together. I had to encourage him for the social life because he would never choose it. But he was always very willing to go and do and be with people and everything. So it was wonderful. It couldn't have been any better. We never fought. We disagreed, but we never fought. And he didn't always give in. I did too. The first time I went to Europe was 1985. That was my year of change. That's when we moved to Detroit. Jeff went off to college, and I got my first trip to Europe. And that was a business trip to go to Stuttgart area with Robert Bosch. And I was hooked immediately. It was just wonderful. And he said, my family came from this town. Are there any croissants in the town? And she got out the phone book and said, oh, yeah. And she said, oh, yeah, there's Fritz. Fritz is another winemaker. So Stan goes over and knocks on the door and says, hi, I'm Stan Croissant. So Stan bought a case of Fritz's wine, which was, he sent it home, and it was awful. It was just, we were in Chicago a year later, and Stan gets this big envelope from Carl Croissant in Mannheim, Germany. And it was inviting us to a celebration in France in 1988 of the Croissant family. The 400th anniversary of a founding of a teeny town called Frederick-Fontaine, where one of the 16 founders was Remy Croissant. We looked at each other and said, you want to go? Shall we take the boys? So the Christmas that year was so fun because we did a treasure hunt. And the first thing was $7. Okay. And then a clue to go to the refrigerator and find clue number 2, which was a passport application. And then someplace else to get the next clue, which was an airplane. And then we went on and gave, I don't know what it was, a French book and so forth, and then the invitation to come to this reunion. So we took the guys and we went over to the reunion. And it was just fabulous. And then we sent them home after a week and we toured around Switzerland. Meanwhile, because of Robert Bosch, we also have German friends in the area. So we went to see them and just have these wonderful relationships with several families in Europe that we've kept up until now. So, okay, now do you want to hear about Bhutan?
Yeah.
Bhutan is the land of gross national happiness. And it is surrounded by China and India, next to Nepal, but there's a little piece of China that comes in there. It is 7,000 feet to 9,000 feet in altitude. Stan couldn't do this trip, but in 2012, I got a letter from my friend Diana, who said the UTEP, University of Texas at El Paso, alumni group is going to have a tour to Bhutan next year. We are taking the first Western opera to Bhutan with a group of students from El Paso. Do you want to go? Yes, I want to go. Yes, I want to go. No, Stan couldn't go because he couldn't do altitude and knew it. So I went off by myself, flew to Bangkok, met up with other UTEP people, had one of the best weeks in my whole life. It was fabulous. Have you ever heard of Tiger's Nest? Climbing Tiger's Nest was just a highlight of my life. It's this wonderful monastery that's a 2,000 feet climb at least, and it's not done by time or area. It's done just to make sure you get to the top. And it was absolutely fabulous. I didn't think I could do it. I couldn't have done it without the people I was with, because they really had to say, come on, we can do it, or let's stop and rest for a bit. And I did it. And I made it back down. And then a couple years later, my granddaughter was a student at William and Mary, and they offered a trip to Bhutan for a summer month. And I said, oh, you have to go. And she did. And then she said, what can I bring you from Bhutan? And I said, well, now, when you climb Tiger's Nest, there will be a spot where you look out and you just, like, you can reach over and touch it. And that's wonderful. But to get there, you have to go down, 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 and around and by the waterfall, and then up, 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 up to get to the monastery. And when you're at that spot, I want you to take your picture there. So I have that. And then I've been to Machu Picchu. I love that, in Peru. I went with my friend Jane. Again, it was on my bucket list, and Stan can't do altitude, but encouraged me to go. I did not climb to the top of Machu Picchu, but just walking around the ruins was wonderful. And then Lake Titicaca, where people live on islands made out of straw, and we got to go on those islands and talk with the people and learn about their crafts and how they, if they didn't like somebody, you could just chop off part of the island and go on your own. My favorite book ever is Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, where he talks about how cathedrals were built in the 12th century. And so in that book, they reference all these places like Saint-Denis in Paris and Santiago de Compostela that were pilgrimage sites at that point in time. And I want to see them all, and I've been to Saint-Denis, and I've been to all of the ones in southern England, like Canterbury and Winchester and Salisbury, and that's just something I love to see. I love the cathedrals and thinking about how they were made at that time. So that, that's kind of drives my bucket list. My regret would be that I waited till I was 45 to travel. But, we were raising kids and money was not there. I mean, we took vacations, yeah, but that's not traveling. And there's so much of the world to see. I want to see it all, and I know I can't. I haven't ever had a place that I'd say, oh, I will never go back to again. I've loved every place I've gone. My boys, to think of Jeff, who in 2 generations have gone from the grandmother that would have had an 8th grade education to a PhD, that in 2 generations, that's a pretty big accomplishment. And Bruce has a master's also, so that's just, wow. And again, if my mother hadn't taken the job at Washington U, accomplishments, First Presbyterian Church. One of Stan's and my biggest accomplishments is mission trips, because shortly after we got back, my kids had gone, Bruce had gone to work camp with First Pres. Jeff, we were gone before that. But Stan said, these kids have had such a good time all this time. Why can't we as adults do this? And so he talked to Budge Gear about that, and Budge said, well, David Murad, this new guy, is coming on as an associate pastor. Talk to him. So we did. Stan did. He really took the bull by the horns on this one. And we led 3 mission trips to Guatemala in 2001, 2002, and 2004. And then Katrina hit, and the theme shifted to missions in the United States. And now, we have this core group of people that love going on mission trips. And it's just so much fun, and it's continued. And that is something I'm very, very proud of. Stan had a younger brother who was Down syndrome. And he was very high-functioning Down syndrome. And his mom, her greatest achievement was to want him to be normal, or appear normal. And he wasn't. And somehow she couldn't get to that point that say, I love you just the way you are. Because frequently she said, well, he looks normal, doesn't he? And it was like, not exactly. But this young man, well, he was about 2 years younger than me. He was the person that I know that I have had in my life that did the absolute best at anything that he tried. He would accomplish it. I mean, if it was taking out the newspapers, he would do that basically before my mother-in-law was finished with them. But, he'd be out, and he knew what his job was, and he knew how to do it, and he did it right. Anything that he was taught to do, he just went over the top as to how to do it. And, well, he loved women. And of course, I was just the cat's meow. He just would do anything for me. He lived in a residential program in Columbia, Missouri, and so we'd see him occasionally. And he always had a girlfriend there. One of my hardest things to do was to tell him, no, he couldn't marry Joni. And I remember sitting on the floor, nose to nose with him, trying to explain why they couldn't get married. And he finally just accepted that. Now, had he ever talked to his mother about that? No. He talked to me. So we had this really, really, really tight bond. And it was just one of the most beautiful things ever. And then, and I'm going to get real teary on this one, when we went to Houston for Jeff's dissertation for his presentation of his master's, or his doctoral thesis, and he had dedicated it to Leighton. So, and Leighton had passed away by that time. But this was the kid that inspired us all, because he was the best he could be, and that taught my kids a huge lesson. Well, at least you didn't ask about my weight and my height and all that stuff.